I want to start my presentation today. This isn't exactly what I planned to start with, but I had to comment on the fact that we've seen a lot of socks in the last 2.5 days. And I just want to ask you all to just think about that for a minute. Like, why have we all spent the last 2.5 days meeting in our stocking feet? And have you ever been to a conference before where you didn't wear shoes? Why did you decide not to wear shoes while you're here? How did that feel? Why did you do it? And how hard was it for you to change your behavior? So this has nothing to do with my talk, but I was up like, I don't know, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning trying to get my presentation done last night, and it just, I started looking for some images and I found these socks on the website, and I thought, that's just really interesting, and I thought I had to point that out, and really just, to get to some of Tina's points, right, about peer pressure, about following social norms. And we think that we're, before you had ever come here, you probably never thought you'd go to a conference in your stocking feet. So just something to think about. So on to the real subject matter. A slice of the pie, and this has nothing to do with food, really. What I want to talk about today is something that we call the behavior wedge. How many of you have heard of the term behavior wedge before? Okay, so a fair number of people. When I talk about the behavior wedge, and it typically refers to work that's being done to understand the human dimensions of energy and carbon and how much energy and carbon can be saved through changes in everyday practices, conservation behaviors, choices about technologies, all of those different things that only happen if we really engage people in the process. It comes from a history of research associated with the stabilization wedges. How many people know what that is? Okay, about half of you. And the stabilization wedges are research into how many different kinds of approaches can we use or need to be used in order to address the climate challenge that we face. Each one of those wedges constitutes roughly 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And I think the underlying message here that's really important is that there's no one silver bullet. Right? There's no one silver bullet here. And so what we have to do is really put together a package of solutions. And this was one attempt at understanding what that package might look like. What are the different pieces of that package that would add up to the amount of savings that we need in order to actually achieve the mitigation that we're after? So in terms of the behavior wedge, I should point out that of those wedges, a lot of them were focused very much on technology. And so they were really, each one of those wedges, it could have been anything from carbon sequestration to really focused on energy efficient transportation mechanisms to a lot of renewable energy sources, from solar to wind, et cetera. So the effort on the behavior wedge was to then say, well, what if we look strictly at behavior? How much of the carbon dioxide emission savings that we're after can be achieved by addressing the human dimensions of the problem, right? And there have been several studies on this. The slide I have up summarizes 3 of the studies that a lot of people are familiar with. The first one is by Dietz et al. In 2009, and this one in particular looks at carbon emission savings, looks across only 17 different household actions. And what they find is that just by focusing on those 17 household actions, we could achieve energy savings, or sorry, carbon savings of roughly 20%. And that 20% is strictly in terms of residential buildings and personal transportation. So they were only looking at the human dimensions of energy and carbon in residential sector buildings and personal transportation, and only 17 actions within that sector. And by looking at those actions, they also didn't say what is the broad range of potential savings, but they limited their estimates to what they call the reasonably achievable savings. And I can get into all the details of that methodology if you're interested, but what I find fascinating is that they have really limited their definition of what the human dimensions are and what the savings around those human dimensions might be to come up with very conservative estimates. And even given that very conservative estimate, suggests that we can reduce carbon emissions from those sources by 20%, which on a national level for the United States is the equivalent of 7.4% of national emissions, and that can be done in 10 years if we set our mind to it, using existing technologies. So I point this out because, you know, a lot of people, when they think about how important is behavior, think, you know, it's sort of an add-on kind of thing. Let's, you know, the big solutions are the technology solutions, and then there's behavior, or then there's the human dimensions. And I want to suggest here that, in fact, we need a different mindset. That the human dimensions of the problem really can offer very large savings. I'm not going to go into detail with these other studies, but essentially they use similar methodologies and find very similar levels of savings, 20 to 30% overall, depending on how many different kinds of behaviors they're looking at, depending on the time scale and depending on the limitations that they place on the study. So there have been numerous studies that have found similar results. And as I said, these are all very conservative and look strictly at residential sector and personal transportation. So this is simply a chart that lists what some of the savings are coming from in terms of the specific behaviors. This one comes out of Gardner and Stern's 2008 study. And I found this kind of interesting because, again, remember, they're only looking at a very limited set of behaviors. In this case, 27 actions, so very short list, unlike the study that Skip Laitner and I did, which was really focused on a much more extensive list. But looking at this limited list, and again, only residential and personal transportation, you can see that there's a mixture of behaviors associated with investment choices, as well as what we might talk about as more on the conservation type of behaviors. So carpooling, for example, high up there on the list. The choice of alternative technologies, replacing incandescents with CFLs, getting frequent tune-ups and air filter changes on your car, turning down the household temperature if you're heating or cooling. Okay, so turning down the temperature if you're heating, turning up the temperature if you're cooling. So there are a lot of things on here, and in fact, when Skip Laitner and I looked at this question between, you know, how much of this is shifting choices about technologies versus how much of it is conservation-related behaviors, we found that more than half of the savings are coming from conservation behaviors. So one last study I want to talk about is a study that was actually done jointly by the Garrison Institute and NRDC, and this is before I was part of the Garrison Institute, but a very interesting study that looked even more broadly. It included things like choices about our diet, and not the, not the weight loss kind of diet, but the carbon kind of diet. How do diet and food waste shape our carbon emissions? How do recycling and consumption decisions affect our carbon emissions, in addition to the transportation and household energy? And this is where we found that by taking all of these things into consideration, and I should point out that this study was focused not on technology adoption, so even it was strictly conservation-related behaviors. So whereas some of the other studies had, okay, I'm going to get a new furnace before the normal end of life of my furnace for conservation-related reasons, this particular study was really focused on just shifts in everyday practices, right? And even so, the savings were incredibly sizable. In fact, they were the equivalent of one of those wedges, 1 billion tons of carbon. And then these are some related examples that I think speak to the fact that it's not just conjecture, that there's actually on-the-ground evidence that these estimates have some basis in reality. So I was talking to Andy Revkin earlier about this crisis situation in Juneau, Alaska. So one of my heroes, and some of you may know him, is Alan Meyer, who works for the, Dina's shaking her head, who works for Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And he's done a lot of work on understanding how behaviors change in the wake of a crisis situations, energy crisis situations. And one of the recent studies that he did was in Juneau, Alaska, following an avalanche. And the avalanche cut the transmission lines. And as a result of that, the residents of Juneau, Alaska had to rely on generators as opposed to hydroelectric power for their electricity. And the fascinating thing to me is that within a couple of days, they were able to reduce their electricity consumption by 25%. Now, they didn't go out and buy new windows, and they didn't go out and buy a new energy-efficient furnace, and they weren't doing a lot of the things that we think about when we think about large energy savings and how we can do our, retrofit our homes, and clearly those things make a huge difference. But that's not what these people were doing. They couldn't get that done in 2 days, right? So in a matter of 2 days, they were able to reduce their electricity consumption by 25%. And a year later, a year after the power line had been restored, were able to maintain a reduction of 8 to 10%. Oh, and one other point, and the graph here shows that these were pretty dramatic savings. Alan Meyer, one of the other pieces of work that he's done is he put together an electronic publication, an electronic book for the International Energy Administration in 2005 that documents this kind of trend in energy crisis situations around the world. And I found it personally very interesting to note that where some of the largest savings had been achieved after energy crisis, where in the world is that? North America, right? And for those of us who study energy, it's probably not a big surprise because we have the biggest per capita energy footprint of a lot of nations. So it's not a surprise to us that there is a lot of potential out there in terms of what we can achieve and what we can achieve using behavior type approaches. One last example. I recently was involved in doing some feedback research. You've heard the term feedback thrown around here a lot in the last 2.5 days, and some of you know that work very well. So the work that I was doing was a meta-review where we looked at 57 different types of feedback initiatives. O-Power is one of them. I don't want to get too much into detail here, but O-Power is one type of feedback that falls into the enhanced billing category here. But we were looking across 57 different types of feedback that provide information about your energy consumption patterns in your home, so residential feedback. Everything from an O-Power type method for delivering that feedback to in-home displays that give you that information. And what's interesting is looking across that, we found average savings, depending on the type of feedback, varying anywhere from 4% to 12%. This is across programs, across program averages. What's possible? Much more than that. These programs were, very rudimentary kinds of programs, but even given that, there were 2 programs that were able to achieve savings, average savings for the entire program of over 20%. So there's a lot of potential out there. That's my main point here. There's a lot of potential out there, whether we're estimating what that might look like or whether we're looking at some real-world examples. So let's think a little bit about the behavioral approach. Why would we choose to take this behavioral approach? We know that we can achieve large-scale savings. They're out there. We know that compared to the huge investments that need to be made, that these kinds of approaches are relatively inexpensive. And we know that they can be achieved incredibly quickly if we use the right tools to get there. So even when we know that, it raises some questions. How do we create that kind of change? And where should we be focusing our efforts? The problem is these national level studies are great, and they give us a little bit of insights about which behaviors matter the most, but they're national studies, and we know that there's a huge amount of variation from place to place in terms of, who's using AC more, who's using heating more, for example. There's a lot of variation in terms of climate, in terms of the building infrastructure, how old it is, how, what it looks like, how much technology saturation there is within these buildings, and how different populations use technologies differently, all of which shape the determination of which types of behaviors. If I'm creating a program and I want to create a program that's going to achieve the greatest savings, how do I know which behaviors I should be focusing on? How do I know that? I can go to the national studies, but they may not apply to my area. And so this program was really about trying to find information that could help cities identify where are the biggest behavioral opportunities given the specific circumstances in your city. So in order to do that, we said, we need to come up with a methodology to help cities to do this. Not every city can go out and do the wonderful research that New York City has done, for example. It's very expensive to go out and collect all this data in order to create these estimates yourself. So we came in partnership with USDN and said, let's just brainstorm some potential strategies. Let's find out whether or not there's some existing data sources out there that we can use so that we can really document the scale of the behavioral opportunities and help cities to do all of these things, to identify which specific sets of behavior offer the most promise, to evaluate the relative importance of behavioral initiatives as part of larger citywide sustainability efforts, to write more effective funding proposals if you want to be doing this work, and to really make the case for pursuing behavior-based opportunities with the people that you work with. So as I said, what we were after was a low-cost approach for doing this. We focused, like the national studies, on achievable savings opportunities, so looking at factors like which households are actually eligible to participate, what is the likelihood of participation, what is the potential range of savings associated with that. So it's not the pie in the sky, you know, all of the potential savings that are out there, but it's really focused on what's really achievable. So our focus was achievable savings. And then lastly, what we really wanted to be able to do was to rank order the options, right? So we have identified the list, which ones offer the most potential. This is just a snapshot of the first page of the report that we ended up creating. The report contains, so we basically put together a profile for the city of Baltimore as a prototype of this effort. And this is work that we've done over the course of the last year with USDN as partners. And the profile contains 3 key components: an overview of the scale of savings for your city. It also provides information about that top 10 list. Which are the top 10 sets of behaviors that are going to offer the most savings for your particular city, and then get into detail about specific opportunities associated with particular energy end uses. So for our prototype, we were focused on the residential sector and focused on energy. And this is sort of the graphic layout, and this is likely to change as we refine the tool, but just to provide an example of what this looks like, what this chart shows, and again, this is the sample for Baltimore, there really should be a line up the middle of the graph there. On the left, we're showing short-term savings opportunities, and on the right, we're showing medium-term savings opportunities, short-term being 4 years or less, and medium-term being 8 years or less. How much we can actually achieve in terms of savings for Baltimore out of the residential sector. And each one of those, each side of the graph has estimates for both single family, which is the blue bars, and multifamily, which is represented by the red bars. And we felt that was really important because as we went through this, we found that the opportunities associated with those 2 different types of residential sector housing were very different. And so we wanted to represent that here. But the interesting thing here is that when we looked at this, we found that in the medium term, there were just shy of 10% savings opportunities in single-family homes and about 3% savings in multifamily homes from behavior. So taken together, obviously, that adds up to about 12% total savings for out of the residential sector in the medium term. You can also see that most of these savings, particularly for single-family homes, came from heating-type end uses, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. So the second component of this report looks at the top 10 list. And this is just an example. This one in particular is for single-family homes. We did both a top 10 list for single-family and a top 10 list for multifamily, which, again, they're very different. But just to use this as an example, what we found is the #1 opportunity for residents of Baltimore was setbacks and using setbacks and programmable thermostats. Not a big surprise, given the characteristics of Baltimore. The second one is furnace maintenance. And as you'll see, wide variety of these actually involve what we would typically refer to as more the conservation kinds of behaviors. But we range everywhere from heating and cooling related to lighting and electronics and plug load. So those are the different categories that we looked at. And then we took each one of those categories and looked more in depth. So this is an example of what the charts look like for heating-related practices, where and the types of behaviors associated with that, everything from equipment replacement to maintenance to settings and setbacks to weatherization and waste reduction. And again, you can see that in this particular case, in terms of heating, settings, and setbacks, combined with maintenance, represented over 50% of the potential savings in heating for the city of Baltimore. Cooling is another example. I just want to take a minute to talk about how we came up with these estimates, because I think that's one of the really innovative parts of this effort, which is to take existing data sources. So we used REX data, and as many of you know, the 2009 REX data provide a lot more detail compared to prior REX surveys, the REX being the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. And then we created a model that used that data using a set of algorithms associated with the number of homes, for example, this is for air conditioning, with central AC, the percent of homes in which, well, that's not a complete sentence. I'm sorry, the percent of homes in which bedrooms is greater than the household occupants, and therefore they had management strategies where they might actually be able to close off certain rooms, not air condition those rooms. Short-term participation rate, in this case, this was the algorithm for the short term, and then the average BTUs for AC, et cetera, et cetera. So we created these algorithms using the REX data as the source of the data, and we then weighted those data based on the specific characteristics of the city of Baltimore using census data. And so we take those three parts of the puzzle, we put them together, and we come up with our estimates for the city of Baltimore. So as we envision this moving into the future, and we are going to continue working on this, what we would like to see for a fully developed behavior wedge model would constitute an effort moving outside of just the residential sector. So we could create estimates for residential, for commercial buildings, for transportation, for food, water, et cetera. Adam and I have worked together to identify a number of existing data sources that we can create similar models for to come up with the full range of estimates associated with both energy and carbon savings, allowing cities to really be able to target their efforts to those behaviors that promise the largest savings opportunities. So our next steps, we have a report coming out very soon. We're going to have a webinar with USDN. And we are planning to do some work in the next year with 5 partner cities to actually create these behavior wedge profile reports, as we call them, for the cities of Charlotte, Miami, Boston, Baltimore, and Park City, Utah. And we had to throw this in there. We hope that we will be working with other cities as well and invite you to join the club. So thank you very much.